Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last webinar discussion of our Fall 2022 Global China Research Colloquium, hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, or the GDP Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Cecilia Springer. I'm the Assistant Director of the Global China Initiative at the GDP Center. At the Global China Initiative, we examine the role of China in the world and the extent to which China's overseas economic activity fosters sustainable development. But today we'll be talking about a larger issue that concerns not only China, but many other countries and global financial institutions. Today we'll be talking about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the African continent, and as well as the debt situation in many African countries. And this is a timely topic today and this week because the US-Africa Summit is currently happening here in the US. And you may have also seen that this week, IMF debt statistics and last week World Bank statistics were released, showing a new picture potentially of what's happening around the world. To give a little bit more context on today's talk, the COVID-19 pandemic has adversely affected the public finances of African countries. It has also led to rising debt levels in many of these countries and increased concerns about their ability to make their scheduled sovereign debt payments over the next few years. This looming debt crisis raises questions about how these countries can most effectively manage their debts and how their creditors can help them develop in sustainable and inclusive ways. So published last year, in 2021, COVID-19 and Sovereign Debt, the Case of the Southern Africa Development Community, is a multidisciplinary book focusing on the issue of African sovereign debt management and renegotiation and restructuring in the SADC, or Southern Africa Development Community region. The book is available for free download through the Pretoria University Law Press. The link is available in the chat. And today we're very lucky to have the editors of this book join us to present the key findings from the publication. And they are Daniel Bradlow, Professor of International Development Law and African Economic Relations at the University of Pretoria, and Professor of Law at American University, Washington College of Law in Washington, DC, and Magalie Masamba, Post-doctoral Fellow with the University of Pretoria Center for Human Rights, and a former Global China Post-doctoral Research Fellow from here at the Boston University GDP Center. So Danny and Magalie will present for about 30 minutes or so, at which point we will open the discussion. So as people are trickling in, I just want to give a quick reminder about logistics before turning it over to Danny and Magalie. I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording will be immediately accessible. And when you have questions, as you inevitably will, please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask your questions, and also share your name and affiliation so we can get to know each other. We will take questions after Magalie and Danny's remarks, but feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box at any time during the discussion. I'll start collecting them. Thank you. And now over to you, Magalie and Danny.
Thank you very much. I'm starting off, and you just give me a minute to share my screen, please. So thank you for that fantastic introduction, Cecilia, and thank you to the GDP Center for having us and giving us another opportunity to share the main findings of our book, COVID-19 and Sovereign Debt, the Case of the Southern African Development Community. So in this presentation, I will provide an introduction to the book. I will set out some underlying assumptions of the book. I will discuss 5 key lessons from the book and an additional lesson. And I'll hand over to Professor Daniel Bradlow to discuss a proposed solution to how we can deal with restructuring Africa's debt, which is a Debt of All Vulnerable Economies Fund. So I'll jump right into it. So this book project really began in 2021 at the height of the pandemic. It began with a call for papers and a series of online workshops that eventually culminated in a 15-chapter book that brought together 17 authors. These authors were from different parts of the world. But what makes this book quite interesting is that it really provided a platform for African voices on issues of sovereign debt management and restructuring. At the same time, it was a fantastic capacity building, capacity development initiative, as a lot of the authors from the continent also partnered with some of the international authors, some of which also include our colleagues at the GDP Center, such as Kevin Gallagher and Yan Wan. There were international reviewers of the book as well. So there were 17 very different perspectives provided in the book, but generally there were 4 themes covered. The first one dealt with global economic structures and the debt landscape in the region. The second broad theme was on debt management and debt restructuring. The third broad theme was our holistic approach to sovereign debt. And finally, there are a series of very interesting case studies covered in the book. So just to give you a little bit of a taste of what these case studies dealt with, there was a case study on Mozambique that dealt with the litigation that arose after the 2016 revelations that government officials had procured at least $2 trillion of I'll call it unlawful debts, so without parliamentary approvals. So that's a very interesting case study. There was a case study on Namibia dealing with the role of central banks with the role of central banks and really fiscal responsibility. South African case study, another very interesting one, dealt with sovereign debt management in South Africa and some of the related issues such as international financial flows, corruptions, and some of the policy reforms that could happen. As everyone would imagine, a Zambian case study, especially in the current climate, is always interesting, especially because Zambia is one of the countries undergoing restructuring and the common frameworks. It's such a fascinating case study. However, this chapter specifically was looking at the 9 basic principles and how important those are in the restructuring process, and applied it to the case of Zambia. And we had 2 chapters on Zimbabwe, the first dealing with resource-backed loans and the challenges that that kind of financing raises, and a second chapter dealing with some interesting proposals on how do we deal with Zimbabwe's very complex debt landscape. So that's just a taste of what's in the book. So the book is available in English, the French version is online as well, and the Portuguese version will be available for free download in the first quarter of 2023. So moving rapidly on, the issue of sovereign debt is very timely. As you've mentioned, Cecilia, at the moment, we have the IMF that just yesterday launched or at least updated its global debt database. And we also have the 2022 World Bank debt report as well. So just to talk a little bit about those before speaking about the book, so we can see what's going on now and how does that influence the lessons in the book. So from the work that the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF has been doing, it's evident that in the past year, so in 2021, the total global debt of the world fell by 10 percentage points to GDP. And what makes this interesting is that this was the largest fall in the past 7 decades, following 2020, where there was the highest increase of global debt in 1 year. But surprisingly, I think this is only good news for advanced economies and possibly some emerging economies, because the situation is very different for low-income developing countries, which actually saw an increase in their global debt. So we can tell already that different countries are experiencing, or at least are experiencing, a debt roller coaster in different ways, and that low-income developing countries are finding themselves in a very difficult position. Interestingly enough, the World Bank report also provides this interesting statistics which are in front of you. The first one is that the total debt stock currently for sub-Saharan Africa specifically is 790 billion. And of this, you'll find that the official creditors, which comprise bilateral and multilateral debt, amount to 245 billion US dollars, and private creditors are 216 billion US dollars. So this is very staggering because on one hand, there is, I guess, the very difficult reality that we have to stomach, which is the fact that African countries will need to borrow externally. And of course, this is has been made more, the need to borrow has been made more urgent, of course, by the COVID-19 pandemic, but other crises that have impacted African economies, such as the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and of course, broader issues such as how do we finance development in general, or the SDGs, and also how do we deal with climate change. And it's clear that the official sources of finance are insufficient, so the private sector plays a very important role on I guess, meeting financing gaps, but also the role of private creditors raises very interesting questions, especially when we deal with the complexities of restructuring privately held debt. So even in a perfect world, if official creditors decided that they could completely write off Africa's current debt stock, this would not necessarily be sufficient to take African countries to a sustainable debt level, because you can see that, you know, the official creditor, the total debt stock from official creditors is 245 billion, but we still have this 216 billion from private creditors. So even in a perfect world, if we had, you know, magical 100% debt relief, we still have a problem when it comes to Africa's debt. So these are actually the recent statistics that the World Bank has provided us in their international debt report. And just to give you a taste of what some of their key findings are before I discuss our key findings in the book, they make 5 main conclusions. The first conclusion is that the risk of debt crisis is intensifying, and without a coordinated action towards debt relief, many vulnerable countries, and by countries I really mean the citizens, will suffer. A second important conclusion that the World Bank made is that debt repayment is, of course, putting a squeeze on the limited fiscal resources of countries. A third conclusion is that there are record high debt levels. A fourth conclusion is that there's a major risk of a global recession. And finally, the conclusion that we need to pay close attention to the role of newer creditors, who are the private creditors and non-Paris club lenders, that I guess make the approach to how we deal with debt management and restructuring a bit more complicated. So going into our research that, as I mentioned, began in 2021 and 2022, and that focused specifically on the Southern African development community, but you'll find that when we look at the key findings, these might be relevant not only for the African continent at large, but really low-income developing countries at large as well. So the first broad finding, or point worth mentioning, is really the importance to revisit responsible borrowing processes. Now here, it's become abundantly clear that the problem of debt does not only require consideration when there's a problem, but from the onset, we need to look at how African countries, or at least how countries in the SADC region, actually procure this debt. And here there is a need for clear public disclosure. There is an important role of public participation, especially through parliamentary processes. And I guess the case of Mozambique is a prime example of the challenges of borrowing without following national processes. And at the end of the day, citizens do need to have an explanation on why their governments are borrowing, what they're borrowing, whom they're borrowing to, and what are the implications. And so I guess the main conclusion there is the need for accountability. A second point, which I guess may not sound novel, but it's still very relevant to discuss, is the importance of debt transparency. And although our work started in 2021, and we've been talking about debt transparency throughout this year and all the webinars we've participated in, you'll see that in the IMF report, as well as the recent World Bank report, they're also speaking about the importance of debt transparency. And here the question is, what should be disclosed, when, to whom? And here, I guess, when it comes to the what, it is not only the borrowing procedures that need to be made transparent, but also debt data disclosure requirements are very important. So you'll find that in compiling databases such as the World Bank's or the IMF's database, data from countries is very important. But this data is also important to allow the public and the public sector, governments, as well as creditors, to have a picture of what the debt landscape looks like and to renegotiate their debt. And I guess a third important point when it comes to transparency that we discuss in the book is really the transparency of the contractual terms themselves. And this is a bit complex because the question is, what should you disclose? What should be kept confidential? And of course, we have certain types of debt agreements that I think are, or at least have gained the reputation of being inherently untransparent, such as resource-backed loans that usually have a lot of confidentiality clauses. So moving rapidly on is, of course, the importance of legal predictability. So at the end of the day, debt is inherently a contractual agreement, and debt contracts, and we use the term very broadly because there are various forms of debt instruments, but these contracts need to be comprehensive. And at least during the time of the pandemic, it became abundantly clear that at times of restructuring, that's when suddenly the contractual clauses become very important, and questions arise on how do we bring everybody to the table and so forth. So not only do these agreements need to have fair risk allocation, specifically by highlighting or being clear on who is responsible for what, but these risks need to be well defined and fairly allocated. And I guess the important thing when it comes to contracts, especially in the SADC region, is really the need for more attention to contracts, for example, by having model agreements. There might be need for capacity development when it comes to how do we draft these agreements, and really how do we negotiate them as well. A fourth important point that arose in the development of this publication is, I guess, a tricky one, and this is evident during the restructuring negotiations, especially arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the question of how do we bring everyone to the table? Specifically, how do we ensure that there's comparability of treatment between different classes of creditors? So unlike in the past, the 90s, where a lot of highly indebted countries went through a HIPC and a multilateral debt relief initiative, the debt landscape has greatly evolved from then. Unlike then, today we not only have the presence of official creditors, but private creditors are playing an important role, as well as non-Paris club creditors. So we need everybody at the negotiating table. And the big question is, how do we ensure comparability of treatment? How do we specifically, I guess the elephant in the room is, how do we get the private creditors to participate in debt relief and debt restructuring initiatives? And again, here, an important point again is the issue of transparency. So do we know what the actual debt stock is? Do we know what the contractual terms are, the restructuring terms, and so forth? The fifth and final broad lesson that arose from the book is the fact that issues of debt management, debt restructuring, and so forth are not only financial issues, but they affect different facets of our lives, whether it's economic, social, political, cultural, and even environmental. So at the end of the day, there is the need for a very comprehensive approach that takes into account all of these perspectives. So debt is not only a financial issue. You could say it's an issue of sustainable development. You could even go as far as saying it's a human rights issue. It's a climate change issue, and so forth. So when looking at how do we come up with solutions that could result in a resilient future or resilient economies, we have to come up with a more comprehensive approach. And in coming up with solutions or proposals on how we deal with debt, we do have to, of course, take into account financial sustainability, but we also have to take into account some broader issues such as environmental and social concerns, human rights, the human rights impacts of a potential debt restructuring, and we have to ensure that there's fair burden sharing. So at the end of the day, when it comes to Africa's debt, when it comes to the debt of the SADC region, it is abundantly clear that there is a need for a new approach. The current global governance of debt management or debt restructuring is insufficient. Of course, we currently have the debt service suspension initiative that expired, that provided temporary relief or debt deferrals to I think 73, if I'm not mistaken, countries qualified, and I think 48 countries participated. We also have the common framework that has 3 countries participating and a few others showing interest, but there's the need for a new approach. There's the need for a debt restructuring mechanism. I've been speaking about it in so many workshops and seminars, but of course we do know that when it comes to the global governance, or at least a rule of law for debt restructuring, there are some political hindrances. So the question is, while we, I guess, slowly make our way towards a more comprehensive approach for debt restructuring, what are some of the innovations that we can implement sooner than later? And I think this is where Professor Daniel Bradlow's part of the presentation comes in. And at the end of the day, we cannot really rely on the kindness of creditors. So while debt relief is going to be important, debt forgiveness is going to be important, we have to come up with a comprehensive approach on how we deal with debt issues. And that approach has to take into account environmental, social, and human rights considerations. So thank you very much. So I'll hand over to Professor Daniel Bradlow to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Magalie, and hello to everyone. Thank you to the GDP Center for organizing this and to Cecilia for chairing this. I'm going to share my screen with some slides. Let me do that first. Also, I should just warn you, it seems that my internet is somewhat unstable. So if I suddenly go silent, please let me know, or I'll try to come back as quickly as possible. As excuse me, as Magalie said, I'm going to build on the 5 lessons that she talked about from the book, and give one suggestion of an approach that incorporates those lessons and gives a creative way to dealing with Africa's current debt problems. So to just briefly summarize some of what she said is that the current approach is problematic for a number of reasons. As Magalie said, there's no formal mechanism that exists that compels anyone to participate in a debt restructuring. So for the private creditors, it's a voluntary process. They participate if it suits them, and if they don't, if they don't feel it would help them. And that has one consequence which tilts the process even further than it would normally be in favor of the creditors, which is the process relies on the debt contracts between the private creditors and the debtor, which means that the focus is on the rights of the creditors in those agreements. To some extent, that's mitigated by collective action clauses, which can enable the majority of creditors to force a hardline minority to accept an agreement. But the effect of that is it underemphasizes the fact that the debtor has many other obligations and responsibilities arising from its constitutional obligations, the treaties it signed, the laws in its own countries. All of that is viewed as of lesser significance in the negotiations than the bond contracts. As Magalie said, many of the solutions ranging from debt forgiveness through to other approaches essentially rely on the kindness of the creditors, in the sense that it's asking them for concessions which they're reluctant to give. And their reluctance is not just because of a lack of kindness, but because many of them have financial incentives to and sometimes legal requirements to maximize the returns that they get on their investments. They have some fiduciary responsibilities and regulatory requirements which might limit their ability to be flexible in dealing with the debtor. Some of that is in a question of interpretation, and so it's not always clear if the creditors are just being as flexible as they could be, or if they're choosing to rely on the law to strengthen their position. But what that suggests is we need a new approach. And the DOVE Fund, which, as Magalie said, stands for the Debts of Vulnerable Economies Fund, and seeks to change this approach through 4 innovations. Firstly, and this is what I want to focus on today, is it has a set of principles to guide the discussions in the restructuring. So to create a conceptual framework that will both the debtor and the creditors accept as the basic principles and framework for their negotiation. Secondly, by doing this, it seeks to change the intra-creditor dynamics so that the creditors become more open to being more creative and innovative in their approaches to what a sustainable debt restructuring might look like. Thirdly, it seeks to reach an optimal outcome rather than a profit-maximizing outcome. And an optimal outcome, as Magalie intimated, is there's a financial return, so it's sensitive to the financing needs of both the debtors and the creditors, but that it also looks for the best possible mix of financial issues, social, environmental, human rights, governance considerations, and reaches an agreement that's optimal for everyone. And finally, it tries, if you use this approach to bring into a DOVE Fund, is to bring in all stakeholders as participants and investors in the debt restructuring, so that everyone, individuals, foundations, civil society groups, financial institutions, non-financial firms, can all participate in a fund that would buy the debt of the sovereign debtor, and then would agree that they would only agree to a restructuring that's consistent with the DOVE Fund principles, which we'll talk about in a second. And in that way, try to change the intra-creditor dynamics to open up space for more responsible outcomes. So the DOVE Fund principles, which is really the core of this, are based on existing international norms and standards that have been developed by a broad range of different actors, ranging from the Institute for International Finance, which is really the interest group representing international banks and financial institutions, the Principles on Responsible Investing, UNCTAD Principles on Responsible Borrowing and Lending, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, OECD standards, the International Capital Market Association, which represents bondholders, civil society organizations. And these DOVE Fund principles are built on 20 of these different standards, all of which are relevant, but none of which completely address all the issues that need to be addressed in a comprehensive approach to debt restructuring. And the focus in these are both on the process of the negotiations as well as the substantive outcomes. And so there are 8 DOVE Fund principles, and I'll take you quickly through them, and then if necessary, we can talk more in the Q&A. So the first principle is a set of guiding norms, and there's 6 of these norms. The first one is credibility, so that all the parties have confidence in the process of debt restructuring. The second one is responsibility, so that they're all seeking an outcome to all the environmental, social, and other issues that are relevant and affected by the debt situation. Third one is good faith, so that all the parties, the debtor and the creditors, have a clear intent to reach an agreement that respects all the rights, obligations, and responsibilities of the negotiating parties. Third one is its inclusiveness, so that all the creditors participate and all the affected parties have access to all the information they need to make informed decisions. And the affected parties include not just the sovereign debtor and the creditors, but all the groups that might be affected by the debt situation. So on the debtor side, that includes the citizens of the country, community groups, small businesses, etc., in the country. But on the creditor side, that also includes those people and institutions whose money is being invested by the bondholders in buying those bonds. So it includes pensioners, school teachers, all those parties as well. And all those interests have to be incorporated in some way. Effectiveness means that there should be a timely and efficient agreement, so that the process does not drag on for an undue amount of time, that the payments that are agreed do not pose an undue burden on the debtor, and do not, over time, undermine a sustainable development process that can lead to the state regaining the country regaining the capacity to enter into a development process that leads to progressive realization of the rights and interests of all its residents. And then finally, optimality, which means that the goal of the process must be to reach an optimal outcome, which, as I said, is the best possible mix of economic, financial, environmental, social, and human rights benefits for all the participating parties. So that's the first principle. Second principle, as you saw from the lessons that Magalie mentioned, is the principle of transparency, so that the process should afford both the negotiating parties and the affected parties access to all the information they need to make informed decisions regarding the restructuring process. So that obviously means the negotiating parties need to understand the scale and scope of the debt problem and how they factor into that and to who all the creditors are. But the affected parties need to have access to at least enough information that they can make an informed judgment about how they will be affected by this situation. Principle 3 is due diligence, so that the sovereign debtor and its creditors should each undertake appropriate due diligence before concluding an agreement or before beginning the process, so that they understand what the stakes are and who's likely to be affected by the process and how. Principle 4 is there should be an optimal outcome assessment. So before the parties conclude their agreements, they should make a statement explaining why they think this is an optimal outcome, as I've defined it, and so that everybody understands what the expected outcome is, and they can hold the parties accountable for reaching that outcome, or at least to understand why they don't reach it if that's what happens. Principle 5 is monitoring, so that in order to make sure we know that we're getting to an optimal outcome, the restructuring process should include credible mechanisms for monitoring the implementation of the agreement. So that's both a financial audit, so sort of standard auditing procedures, but also some mechanism for monitoring the implementation of the social and environmental aspects of the transaction. Principle 6 is intercreditor comparability, so that all the sovereign's creditors participate and make a comparable contribution to the restructuring. I mean, as we saw in Magalie's presentation, that's important, and the creditors need to have the confidence that if they make some contribution to the restructuring, that the benefits of that go to the debtor and the country and not to another group of creditors who are being less forthcoming in the negotiations. Principle 7 is fair burden sharing, so that an optimal outcome should share the burden of the restructuring fairly between the negotiating parties and not pose impose any undue costs on any of the affected parties. And that means an assessment including of capacity to bear some of the loss. And in this regard, I think it's important to keep in mind that often a debt crisis is not caused just by one side, by the debtor alone. Often it's the creditors bear some of the responsibility, and sometimes, as during the pandemic, it's because of a shock that's outside anybody's control, and it's not fair that only one side should have to bear the consequences of that. So that's the importance of fair burden sharing. And then the last principle is maintaining market access. Now, it's obvious that if a debtor is defaulted on its debt or has to restructure, its ability to gain market access in the short run is likely to be limited. But as we saw from Magalie's presentation, is African countries will not be able to get the financing they need to deal with the climate challenges they faced, to the infrastructure problems that they have, meet the SDGs, unless they're able to raise hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And they can only do that, or they can't do that, relying just on official sources and grants. They're going to have to use private sources in some way. And so that one of the goals of any sustainable debt restructuring has to be to help them regain access to private financial markets, at least over the medium term, so that they can begin a development process that's sustainable and inclusive over time. The last thing to say about this, because over the last year, in addition to this book, we've been working on a project to develop the Dove Fund. We've tested this concept and these principles with a broad range of interested groups, people at the IFIs, the World Bank, the IMF, with investors, with civil society groups, with legal and sovereign debt experts. And we're now in the process of trying to find a test case where we can try the principles out in a particular place in a particular country to show that they actually can contribute and lead to a more positive and sustainable outcome that would be applicable. One of the things we're looking to do, because we recognize no one's going to give the two of us or a small group of people interested in doing something like this hundreds of millions of dollars so that we can be a powerful voice in a particular debt negotiation, but is to see can we raise enough money or find a way to essentially have a token investment in a particular country's debts, and then use that as a way of having a voice in the negotiations, probably more of a whisper than a voice, but at least some ability to participate, and then where we can advocate actively and without lots of support and communications strategies for the Dove Fund principles to become the conceptual framework for that country's debt negotiations. So we're hoping that over the next year or so, we can take the work from this book and this Dove Fund project and convert it into policy in some particular area. I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions on all of this. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much to Danny and Magalie for sharing more about their book, the overall situation, as well as some of the potential innovative solutions to this problem. So we'll now move into the Q&A portion of this webinar. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, introduce yourself and ask your question. So we already have a couple of questions, and I'll pass those over to Danny and Magalie. First, we have a question from Mikel Munoz Cabre from the Stockholm Environment Institute. And Mikel asks about the IMF packages. So the IMF packages, for example, in Zambia, prevent the government from providing any sovereign guarantees. And this is a big problem, he points out, especially for renewable energy investments, which, unlike extractives, do not generate hard currency. So how can the IMF requirements be addressed to ensure continued renewable energy investment in Zambia and other SADC countries in the short term, or so roughly the next 5 years? So question about renewable energy investment. And next we have a question from Jenny Hall. Actually, I think we have the same question, so I'll also partly insert my moderator's privilege. I think a big, elephant in the room, so to speak, when talking about debt is the role of China. And so if you could talk a little bit about the extent to which your book addressed the role of China in the debt situation in SADC countries. And Jenny is also asking, it would be interesting to know what kind of engagement you've had with Chinese stakeholders and any traction that your research has had, particularly with Chinese actors and institutions. So let's start with those first two questions. Over to Magalie and Danny, and others, please continue entering your questions in the Q&A box.
Okay. Magalie, do you want to start?
Sure. I'll start and I'll hand over to you. I'll mainly focus on the first question, which I think is a really important one, and probably it's a good opportunity to also share that the Center for Human Rights, the GDP Center, as well as SARCHI, which is Southern African Development Community Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, this year, was it this year, Cecilia? This year launched a report, which is the Renewable Energy Transition in a Period of Debt Distress in Southern Africa, the Role of Development Finance Institutions, and that tackles the challenges with financing renewable energy projects in the SADC region, and or at least in the Southern African region. And I think one of the major issues was, how do we de-risk projects? And I think one of the main findings of, I guess, the workshops and the discussions that arose from that report, and hopefully a link to that report can be shared, because I think it's quite instructive, is that the main issue, at least during the COVID-19 pandemic, was making renewable energy projects more bankable, especially by de-risking them. Especially, I think it was off-taker risk that was one of the main issues highlighted. So of course, government guarantees are one way of de-risking projects and attracting additional finance. But what was, I guess, concluded from that report is that multilateral development banks can and hopefully will play a greater role in helping to mobilize resources and de-risk projects. So maybe if countries like Zambia can't actually provide government guarantees to finance projects, maybe multilateral development banks that care about renewable energy and climate change need to play a greater role. So maybe I'll just mention that report could be something worth looking at, especially when it's when looking at the role of multilateral development banks. I'll mainly comment on that question. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Magalie. It looks like, unfortunately, Professor Bradlow's internet connection must have dropped off. So let's hope that he joins us again in a moment and we can return to perhaps the question about China. But in the meantime, Magalie, since it's just you and me for the moment, maybe I can ask a little bit about your projections for the new year. We're almost at the end of 2022. Hopefully everybody's gearing up for a nice break. But certainly there are ongoing polycrises around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic is in some ways far from over. So drawing from, what you've learned from this book, which came out certainly during a very tumultuous time, what do you see on the policy agenda for 2023 regarding debt restructuring in the SADC region? And then what do you hope to see happen in terms of some of the policy recommendations coming from your book? What might really be possible on a one-year time horizon?
That's a really tough question. But what I can say is, I'll start off by mentioning the fact that I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I think when it comes to the debt landscape in Africa in general, 2023 will probably be a worse off year. And one of the reasons I'm saying that, or predicting it, one of the reasons I'm predicting it is I think that a lot of the countries in the region are going to face a challenging debt repayment schedules, specifically because, of course, higher interest rates when it comes to finance. Of course, a lot of the debt, the current debt is maturing, so the principals are maturing, but also we do have to remember the compounding interest from the debt service suspension initiative deferrals. So a lot of those payments are going to be made in 2023, 2024, I imagine. So when it comes to the policy recommendations or the approach, I have a feeling that African countries are definitely going to be calling for more debt relief and debt forgiveness, more than restructuring. However, when it comes to restructuring, it's very challenging, because I guess it also goes to the question of how do we bring everyone to the table? And I guess the prickly question is, on one hand, how do we bring private sector creditors to the table and restructure those debts? But the other question is also China, which is one of the major, in fact, is the continent's main bilateral creditor. And I guess when it comes to the role of China's participation in restructuring processes itself, I think it's very encouraging to see China being part of the creditor committee on the Common Framework Restructuring of Zambia. And I think they're the co-chairs with France, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that's extremely encouraging, bearing in mind that that is a major creditor. But without private sector participation, I think China will be discouraged to participate. But I can see Danny Bradlow. Daniel Bradlow has just joined us. And yeah, I'll give you a chance to continue sharing your thoughts, Danny.
Yeah, I'll just, if you're back, Danny, then I can just catch you up briefly. Magalie shared some responses specifically about continuing to encourage, oh, he's gone again, renewable energy investments. So then Magalie, in that case, I have a couple more questions from the Q&A box that we can have you address. So first is from German Zarate from State University of New York, Cortland. And German draws a parallel with Latin America and the African continent. So one of the similarities is that weak institutions allow the predominance of the executive in contracting with lenders, especially China, as you noted, one of the largest bilateral creditors for many African countries, while the legislative and judicial branches have no voice or oversight relative to the executive branch. So German asks, what do you think is the most important institutional change that could make the process more democratic at the high levels of government? We also have a question from Rebecca Ray, who's a senior researcher here at the GDP Center. And Rebecca asks, what prospects do you see for African governments to adopt greater debt transparency practices? This being a particularly timely question given recent releases of debt statistics. So let's start with those couple of questions. Again, Magalie, thank you for taking this on, and we'll hope that Danny is back shortly.
Yeah, I think German's question is really important because it speaks to the issue of accountability, which is one of the main themes that is actually discussed in the book. And I think the case study for Mozambique is evidence of what happens when you don't have enough checks and balances. So generally, with a lot of African countries and even countries in the region like Mozambique, lending would have, or borrowing would have to go through a process of parliamentary approval, which is, I guess, focused on the executive, which in itself is lacking at times. So lending would, borrowing would have to go through the parliamentary approval. But I would imagine that, and I don't know enough about the individual laws of the SADC countries, but I would imagine that additional checks and balances, for example, approval by the Office of the Attorney General could, for example, provide an additional layer of protection, because then that would provide some legal scrutiny on the actual contractual terms, the agreement itself. So maybe the Office of the Attorney General of a country could participate, and that could be a way of, I guess, another layer of protection. So it's a pity that I don't know enough about the process of the individual countries, but definitely I think there are creative approaches to ensure that There's participation of the different branches of government, from the negotiation process, scrutinizing the agreement itself, signing and even executing debt agreements. So I think different ministries should play an important role, but also, different branches. And I think having the Office of the AG actively participate is also helpful. But this is definitely something I will probably think more about, and it might be worthwhile to also maybe engage with some of the authors of the book that provide case studies, like if German is interested in getting to know what happened in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Namibia, and probably those authors could provide in-depth ideas. And I'm sure they would be willing to have those conversations. On the second question, which is about greater transparency, the issue of transparency is becoming more vocally discussed in globally. So if you look at the IMF debt monitor report that was launched yesterday, in which I participated in the launch in the panel as well, there was also an emphasis in that report on debt transparency. And even in our book, we speak about debt transparency. The World Bank debt report speaks about debt transparency. So I think the time has come where the issue of transparency has to be addressed. The question is, how should individual countries address them? That would require assessing what are the weaknesses. So is the issue, for example, a lack of transparency on how debts are procured because there aren't enough checks and balances, such as parliamentary approvals, participation of offices of attorney generals? Another question is, are countries in the region providing debt statistics? So for example, an interesting point on that, which is in the IMF report, is the fact that and I guess it's one of the weakness of the statistics that they have, is that a lot of agreements have confidentiality clauses, but also governments might define public debt in very different ways. So it could be very limited to loans and securities, and might exclude more complex debt or financial transactions. There's also the issues of liabilities that arise from contingent liabilities, such as guarantees, that might not be upfront debt. So there is a need for transparency, and I guess, accounting processes, data disclosure is important when it comes to transparency. But those are my thoughts in the meantime when it comes to transparency. But what are the prospects? I think the time has come where we do have to take transparency seriously. If not, we're going to find ourselves every decade in the exact same position as we did during the HIPC initiative, and even today, where many African countries have unsustainable debt levels.
Great, thank you, Magalie. Professor Bradlow, are you there? Can you hear us?
I am. I'm back, at least temporarily. I apologize for this, but the joys of load shedding in South Africa at the moment.
Great.
But I've sort of missed the conversation, so I think maybe just move on and I'll catch up on the next question.
Yeah, I think we just have a few minutes left. So if your internet allows, Professor Bradlow, we have a couple of questions just that maybe you could field, since Magalie has very ably fielded the previous round of questions. So one question for you is about the Dove Fund. It seems very needed, particularly as other attempts for joint debt renegotiations like the G20's DSSI have not yielded the results that many observers had hoped. So what prospects do you see for the Dove Fund to find an institutional sponsor to develop such an initiative? And then lastly, we have a question from Lyric Hale, who raises a bold idea, noting that the level of worldwide debt is at a precipice. 25 nations are already in default. The COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented. Why not create a global debt jubilee? I'm assuming this means large-scale debt for forgiveness. assuming you could make that happen, what would that look like? So with these two questions, then we'll close out our Q&A and get thoughts from Professor Bradlow. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cecilia. So maybe to start with the second question, because in a way, it's the answer to the second question leads to the first question. So the problem with the debt jubilee is, if we saw with the last debt jubilee at the end of the last century, is you get debt forgiveness to some extent, at least, as happened through the HIPC initiative and the MDRI. But the countries that got the benefits of that had good looking debt statistics for a while, but then began to borrow more from the private sector and through the bond markets than they did through official creditors, because of the crisis that was looking for places to invest. And they began to build up more debt. And now we're facing a new round of potential debt crises in the coming years. And the reason for that, as I sort of intimated, is that because of the challenges of the climate crisis that Africa is facing and is already beginning to experience, if you look at, for example, the droughts, the serious droughts in East Africa and the flooding in other parts of the continent, because of that, because of the need for infrastructure, because of the need to deal with the problems of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and the rising youth bulge in Africa, Africa needs far more money for it can expect through grants from both either traditional or non-traditional donors, or for concessional financing, or favorable term financing from the multilateral institutions. And so it's going to have to raise that money somewhere else. And if debt is forgiven, the consequence of that is it reduces the incentive for anyone to lend more money to Africa. The amount of money that will be saved through the debt forgiveness might be enough to help Africa for 1 or 2 years, but it's not ultimately sustainable. And it's, as you saw from the numbers, it's about 700 or 800 billion in total. And that's not going to be enough to meet all the needs that Africa have, which are estimated over the next 10 years or so to be in the trillions. So the debt forgiveness looks good, and it certainly has some short-term benefits, but it's ultimately not in problems. So that leads to what else can we do? And that's where the Dove Fund comes in. I mean, as Magalie said, is ultimately what's needed is some sort of formal sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, where when a country gets into a debt crisis, it can go to the international equivalent of a corporate bankruptcy procedure, where all the creditors, all the stakeholders have to come get together, and in a process that's overseen by a judge or some independent decision maker, reaches a solution based on law and experience that is to mimic that process in a context in which we don't have a formal way of doing that. I mean, the chances of finding an institutional sponsor for it we're still exploring, so I can't give you a good answer to that. I can only say I've spoken to over 50 different people from financial institutions, international organizations, civil society, experts of various sorts, and the response has been uniformly favorable. So, I mean, to be honest, it's a clearly reformist approach. It's not all that radical. It's carefully designed so that its principles that all the creditors have are on the record as accepting in some way or another, and just saying how we're putting it into a conceptual framework that we can operationalize in a way that's comprehensive and fair to all the relevant interests that are affected by this. And that's been accepted by everyone, but that we still, as we said, we have to translate that into something more practical, and we're in the process of trying to explore that. But so far, the process is ongoing. We haven't found the home for that yet. But if people are interested or have suggestions on people we could talk to, please feel free to reach out and we'd love to talk more about it.
Great, thank you so much. And that's a very exciting note to end on. I hope that the audience can think about being in touch with the editors here. So thank you so much to Danny and Magalie for sharing their thoughts with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined this very interesting discussion. So the webinar has been recorded on YouTube. We will share the link in the chat. I just want to make a quick plug before we end that the GDP Center is currently recruiting for our Global China Fellows program, and the deadline is at the end of this week. So if you are a pre-doc or a recent graduate, or if you know one, please do consider sharing that and or applying to the program. And there's more about that in the chat. So today's webinar was the last from our fall 2022 Global China Research Colloquium. Stay tuned and join us again for a series of exciting webinars that will be taking place next year. To receive updates on our publications and events, you can subscribe to receive updates from the Global China Initiative. And thank you again so much to our discussants today. Definitely learned a lot. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a happy new year. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.